So today I'll be talking about convex Cayley configuration spaces. So I'll start where Sean left off last week. So he talked about the single interval property and defined what Cayley configuration space was. So this idea of convex Cayley configuration spaces is sort of a generalization of the single interval property to multiple non-edges. And I'll talk about some interesting results um, with regards to the convex Cayley configuration spaces. And I'll talk about some applications to DR plans. DR plans is something we've been studying in this course for the last few weeks. And Dr. Sitaram gave a talk on flex DR plans in one of the rigidity workshops. So you'll see how this idea of convex Cayley configuration spaces is applied there. And the other application with regards to DR plan is this idea of Cayley recombination, where we before 2 weeks ago we were talking about how we are optimizing for algebraic complexity when we are recombining solutions given a DR plan. So this is a different take on that, a different way of doing it. And that will probably cover all of today. And then on Thursday, I'll talk about application of convex Cayley configuration spaces in 3D to molecular assembly. Okay, so I'll get some definitions out of the way first. So we define a K-sum of two graphs, G1 and G2, containing a K-clique as a proper subgraph by gluing G1 and G2 by identifying matched pair of vertices that belong to the K-clique. And when you do this operation, G1 and G2 are called the K-sum components. And given a graph, you can run the inverse operation where you inverse operation of this, where you kind of separate them and then you have the two K-sum components. So when we're doing the inverse operation, if you're unable to do this separation by identifying a clique, common clique, then we call it a minimal K-sum component. And given a non-edge in the graph, the minimal K-sum component containing the non-edge F is a minimal subgraph that is both a K-sum component and contains the vertices of the non-edge F. So it's not really a K-sum component that is minimal and happens to contain F, but rather it's a minimal subgraph that has both K-sum component and contains the vertices of F. So this is going to be a little bit of recap. Sean talked about this last week. Given a linkage that is a graph with edge length as positive edge length assignments to E and a set of non-edges F. Its d-dimensional Cayley configuration space denoted as phi df g delta. That here the d is the dimension in which you're realizing, F is the set of non-edges. So the Cayley configuration space is the set of realizable distance values for the non-edges in F in dimension D. So if you take this example over here, so this is a linkage ABCD. I've given edge lengths 1 to all of the edges, and I'm choosing this dashed line here CB to be my non-edge F. So the Cayley configuration space of this linkage on this non-edge is all of the realizable values that all of the lengths that CB can take in any realization of this linkage. So as you can see, this can take a value anywhere between 0 and 2. And given a linkage and a non-edge of the graph F, the pair GF has what we call the d-dimensional single interval property. If the Cayley configuration space of the graph on F is connected for all edge length assignments delta. So again, this is an example where for your non-edge F, your this has the single interval, so it just takes a single interval from 0 to 2. Whereas this example over here, I've taken the non-edge to be v1, v2, this red dashed edge, and this is again in R2, and because this is this can only be drawn in two different ways, where v2 is on this side or the other side. It has only this v1, v2 has only two realizable edge lengths, and it's not a single interval. There are two disconnected points. Okay, so with this definition of a Cayley configuration space, these are some of the interesting questions we ask about them. So the first question we ask is characterize graphs with connected convex linear polytope 2D Cayley configuration space. So this again is a generalization. It's not just talking about on a single non-edge, but rather on a set of non-edges. Then the second interesting question is this idea of inherent connected Cayley configuration spaces. And so these 2 points will be where I'll be spending bulk of the first hour of the lecture. And then other interesting questions here include, if you're given a graph, can you efficiently recognize if the graph has convex Cayley configuration space? And the last one is about sampling and realization. So again, going back to the single interval property, this was a theorem. Sean talked about this a little bit last week. I'm not going to go into the proof of this theorem here. So given a graph G and a non-edge F, the Cayley configuration space on F for the graph G and edge length assignments delta is a single interval for all delta, if and only if the minimal two-sum components of G union F that contain F are partial two trees. So this result is true in R2, but it does not extend to R3. So for example, you can have partial three trees like the two shown here and a non-edge such that, these are not partial three trees. You can have graphs that are not partial three trees, but they still have the single interval property. So you can take these 4 vertices. These are K4, and then you can imagine these two as the wings, and they kind of hinge around these edges, and the length of this non-edge F is just a single interval. It's the same here. So this is one of the problems that Mira, Sean, William, Lefteris, and I are currently working on to find a characterization for this. Okay, so we will next talk about characterizing graphs with convex Cayley configuration spaces. This is again a theorem in this paper by Sitaram and Gao. So this theorem has 2 components. The first says that if you have a graph and the graph has a two-sum component G dash that is an under constraint partial two tree, then there exists a non-empty non-edge set F that is entirely in this two-sum component, such that for any edge length assignments to the graph, the Cayley configuration space on these non-edges is a linear polytope. Moreover, there is such an F such that this configuration space is generically complete for the graph. And the second part of the theorem is that if a graph is an under constraint partial two tree, then for any non-empty non-edge set f dash that preserves the partial two tree when you add it to the edge set, then this Cayley configuration space is still a linear polytope. So we'll go into the proof of this theorem a little bit.
Sorry, Rahul, could you say again, what does generically complete mean?
So here, generically complete is talking about G being minimally rigid. So I can pick non-edges F so that when I add it to the graph, the graph becomes minimally rigid, and your configuration space, that's what it's talking about.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so right, so we are trying, first we'll try and prove A, and to prove A you need this lemma here that kind of depends on the lemma 5.7. So let's go them one by one. So if you take a graph G, and if G is the two sum of a whole bunch of GIs, then for any edge length assignment delta, G delta has a realization only if each of the two sums has a realization. I don't think this should be very hard to see. I mean, it kind of intuitively makes sense that each of the two sums should have a realization. So take a graph. We're talking about lemma 5.7 now. We take a graph with two sum components GI and a non-edge set F that is entirely contained within one of these two sum components. Let's say that two sum component is G1. Then for any delta, that is the edge length assignments, the Cayley configuration space of the original graph G on the non-edge set F in 2D is the same as the Cayley configuration space of this G1 in which we have added the non-edges. If all the GIs, hang on. Oh yeah, sorry. These two are the same if all GS are non-empty. That is going back to this lemma here. Otherwise, this is empty. So all it's saying here is that if you can find a two-sum component and stick in non-edges into the two-sum component, that then the configuration space of the two-sum component is the same as the configuration space of the entire graph. So we are proving A here. So which is again saying that if you have an under constraint partial two tree as one of the two sum components, then your configuration space is a linear polytope. Okay, so we're starting with the setup that G dash is an under constraint partial two tree. So because it's an under constraint partial two tree, we can find a non-empty set of non-edges G dash by adding which you can make it a complete two tree. And we call this these edges that we add to make it a complete two tree as F. Note that such an F is a completion of G dash that makes G dash minimally rigid. So because two trees are minimally rigid, adding in F makes it minimally rigid. So the Cayley configuration space is full measure and generically complete. So that proves the the second part, the generically complete part. Now we get to the polytope part of it. So a two tree can be written as a two sum of triangles, and because it can be written as a whole bunch of two sum of triangles, all the edge lengths and the non-edge lengths are governed by triangle inequalities. So you have a whole bunch of triangle inequalities governing the lengths of these non-edges, and because of that, this thing is a linear polytope. Have so now, since f is entirely in, we assume that f is entirely in G dash. So we can kind of use lemma 5.7 here, which said that if it's entirely in the two-sum component, in one of the two-sum components, the configuration space is configuration space of the original graph is also the same thing. So that's for all edge length assignments. The configuration space of the original graph is also a linear polytope. Let's go back to B here. So we prove B now. So here it's saying that if the graph is an under constraint partial two tree, then for any non-empty non-edge set F that preserves the partial two treeness, the configuration space is a linear polytope. So for any under constraint partial two tree, we can again find a set of non-edges that make it a two tree. And we have showed that when we make this a two tree, this whole thing about it becomes generically complete, and the linear polytope is the Cayley configuration space is a linear polytope. So we can take any non-empty subset f dash of such an f. So note that when you have a partial two tree, there is no unique completion. There's no unique set that make it a two tree. I can give you several different types, usually several different sets of edge that complete it to several different two trees. So I'm picking one of those completions. So we take any non-empty subset f dash of such a completion. These are exactly the subsets that would preserve the partial two treeness, because starting with a partial two tree, you're going towards a two tree. So any edge you add will be subset will be contained in the two tree. So this preserves the partial two treeness. Therefore, the Cayley configuration space on any of these subsets is kind of a projection on a projection of the entire configuration space with all the non-edges on these f dash that you have chosen. And because we proved in the first part that this portion, that is the Cayley configuration space on the non-edges that completed to a two tree was a polytope, its projection is also a linear polytope. Okay. So this theorem here is kind of extending that previous result a little bit. So it says that given a graph and a non-empty set of non-edges, the 2D Cayley configuration space is a linear polytope connected or convex for all edge length assignments delta, if and only if all minimal two-sum components of G union F containing any subset of F are partial two trees. Furthermore, the Cayley configuration space is generically complete if and only if the under constrained minimal two-sum components of G are partial two trees, and the minimal two-sum components of G union F containing F are two trees. So it's basically saying everything in the previous theorem and extending it a little bit. So we'll not spend too much time on it. So we move on to this idea of inherent Cayley configuration spaces. So in the previous section, when we talked about convex Cayley configuration spaces, I always gave you a graph and a non-edge set. And I said that for this graph on this non-edge set, you had a convex Cayley configuration space. But in this idea of inherent Cayley configuration space, all I'm saying is that if I give you a graph H, you can partition the edges of H any which way into two sets E and F. Then the graph G got by the edge set will always admit convex Cayley configuration space on the set of non-edges F. Was that clear? Okay. And again, this will be something we recall from last week's lecture, this idea of deflattenability. So a graph is said to be deflattenable if for every edge length assignments, delta, a Euclidean realization in any dimension also has a realization in RD. I don't think this has to just be Euclidean, but that's just the way I've written it. Okay. So this is an interesting result that kind of connects flattenability with this idea of convex Cayley configuration spaces. So the theorem here states that if a graph is deflattenable, it admits inherent connected d-dimensional Cayley configuration space. So this is going in one direction. It's saying that if a graph is deflattenable, it admits inherent d-dimensional Cayley configuration space. So this was proved in the Sitaram Gao paper for L2 only. But a later paper kind of proved this for general LP norms, and also it proved the reverse direction. So first I'll talk about the proof of this in just L2 and just the one direction, and then we'll look at the generalization a little later on. Okay, so does everyone know what a Euclidean distance matrix is? So it's just a n by n square matrix, which happens to have the property that there exists some assignment of points P1, P2 belonging in RD for some dimension D, such that the distance between Pi and Pj corresponds to the ijth entry of the matrix. So this is again symmetric and zero diagonal matrix and all the good stuff. So start with this idea of an Euclidean distance matrix. So a classical result that that was in one of Schoenberg's papers that follows from the positive semi-definites of Gram matrices says that the set of all Euclidean distance matrices is a convex cone. So because the this n by n matrix is the set of if you think of this as the vertices of a graph, you're thinking of all v square distances. That's the convex cone. The projection of this cone on any set E union F is also convex. So you're taking a convex thing and taking a projection of it on some edges. So that's going to be convex. So by the definition of G flattenability of a graph, so we're taking a different graph H here with the vertex set V and the size of the vertex set is N. This kind of projection on the edge set is exactly all of the square distance assignments to the pairs in E union F, for which the graph H has a realization in RD. So we denote this projection onto the set of E union F as the Cayley configuration space in D dimensions E union F. So I put squared here because I'm talking about the squared Cayley configuration space here. It's just that instead of realizable lengths, I'm taking the squares of the realizable lengths. So now we take a section of this projection that is obtained by restricting this delta star that I defined here for H to be delta over the set of edges. And this is exactly the Cayley configuration space of the graph G delta for its non-edges F. So since this Cayley configuration space was section, I mean, we only took sections and projections here, and sections and projections preserve convexity. So this sections and projections of this original cone that they preserve convexity. So the Cayley configuration space that we get here is convex. So notice that I did not make any assumptions about E and F here. You can partition the graph into any set of edges and non-edges. So this kind of shows that if a graph is deflattenable, then what direction are we going? Yeah, if a graph is deflattenable, it admits inherent Cayley configuration space. So you can partition the graph into any set of edges and non-edges. Were there any questions so far? Okay. So like I was saying earlier, this theorem by Sitaram and Willoughby kind of extended the previous result for any LP norm. So this theorem says that for any LP norm, a graph G is deflattenable if and only if G admits inherent d-dimensional Cayley configuration space for each of its subgraphs. So if you notice the previous proof that went from graph is deflattenable to it admits inherent connected Cayley configuration space, only relied on the fact that the cone was convex. So to prove this for any LP, all we'd have to show is the cone of square distance vector NLP is convex. So this notation is slightly different. N is the points and LP is the new norm. So if you can show that this is convex, then our previous proof would just go through. But for this is the only if direction. But for the if direction, we would need to show that the cone is a convex hull of the LPP distance vectors in any dimension. So yeah, like I said, for the only if direction.
Rahul, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. I cannot see the chat, sorry. Is the result for all P in the closed interval? I don't think it applies to L infinity. I'm not sure. maybe Dr. Sitaram can pitch in. I think it's the open interval. So he's asking if this LP norm is.
Yeah, I don't think we showed it for infinity norm.
Yeah. So.
But it
was just the open interval of.
The paper has some results for the infinity norm just for
this particular theorem. I don't think was
for the case of dimension 2, because then L1 and L infinity pretty much behave the same way. But that was in about forbidden minors later in the paper. Yeah.
So is it true for L1? Was it? I got a bit lost on that.
Yes, this is true for L1.
Okay, so it's just L infinity that's the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, L infinity is a problem. I mean, we used that this convexity. If you took the D strata and take the convex hull for any D, you basically get the cone. And that uses, I think you gave that proof Sean, in your lecture.
Yeah, and the proof, as far as I could tell, didn't work for L infinity.
Correct.
Because you need to.
Correct. Yes, because you're adding up those. Exactly.
Yeah,
you're adding up those distances.
P, and if P is equal to infinity, then things don't make much sense.
That's
why I was wondering about the question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll talk about the if direction of the proof. So this is going from if your graph admits.
I think Sean gave this proof, right, Sean?
I think so. Could I just see the statement to remind myself?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't do it for LP, but I don't think there's much difference.
No, I think you did do the sum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just need to.
So you can go over it one more time if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the only change is the squared stuff turns into P, and then
P, exactly.
Yeah,
so this last, the second bullet, that's what the entire proof basically just uses the second bullet. Yeah.
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 Okay, go ahead, Rahul. That's okay. You can repeat it. Yeah.
So yeah, okay. The if direction. Yeah, we're going from the graph admits inherently convex Cayley configuration space to the graph is deflattenable. So suppose what am I saying here? All d-dimensional Cayley configuration. Okay. This should be G dash, I think. Yeah. So we're taking the d-dimensional Cayley configuration space. We're talking about the d-dimensional Cayley configuration spaces corresponding to subgraphs of G, minus the non-edges. And we're saying that we're asserting that they're convex. And we note that because here we said that for all subgraphs, this is convex. This should certainly be true for the empty subset F. And we denote that empty subset here, the configuration space of the empty subset here. And this is just the configuration space G of the entire graph. Because this is convex, it is its own convex hull. So if you take a d-dimensional stat of that, it turns out to be the same as the d-dimensional strata of the graph turns out to be the projection of the convex hull on the set of vertices. This turns out to be the entire cone. So, kind of shown that the Cayley configuration, the configuration space of D-dimensional, the D-dimensional strat of the configuration space is the entire configuration space. So it's deflatable. And I think that was it. So these are some of the references for the things I have talked about so far. And now I'll talk about some of the applications of this idea of convex Cayley configuration spaces. So I'd like us to recall that a DR plan of a constrained graph is a forest where each node in the forest is a rigid subgraph of G. The root node is a maximal rigid subgraph. The internal nodes is a union of its children. And then the leaf nodes are single constraints. So we also talked about in previous lectures about this idea of the size of the DR plan. That is the what's the size of the largest indecomposable system that we have to contend with. So sometimes it turns out that even with an optimal DR plan that kind of reduces the size of the largest indecomposable system, the size of the largest indecomposable system you get is very large to be tractable. So these are pictures from Mira's talk on flex DR plans. Here, both these graphs, this is in 2D by the way, both these graphs do not have any non-trivial subgraph that is rigid. So there's no rigid subgraph bigger than a triangle. So if you try and decompose this, the size of the largest indecomposable system kind of depends on the size of the graph. So it can get very ugly. So to deal with these kinds of issues, they have this idea of what they call the flex K DR plan. So it differs from DR plan in just one crucial way, in that for a DR plan, you needed each node is a subgraph of G that was rigid, but here you allow each node of the DR plan to have K degrees of freedom. So you allow it some flex so that you can have a much nicer DR plan, and the size of the DR plan is maybe constant.
Sorry, what's meant by a maximal subgraph here? Maximal in what sense?
Where maximal subgraph?
Maximal rigid subgraph or?
Maximal rigid maximal rigid subgraph, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So I missed rigid here.
All right, cheers, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so we use this idea of flex DR plan in elucidating the configuration space of these cycloalkanes. So cycloalkanes are these hydrocarbons where the carbons form a ring, like a single ring, and then they're attached to hydrogen atoms. And when the number of carbon atoms in this ring is 6 or less, this hydrocarbon is rigid and it has only finitely many configurations. For example, this cyclohexane has only 2 configurations, the chair and the board configuration as they call it. But if the number of carbon atoms in this chain is greater than 6, you have some flexes, and there's a lot of interest in studying the configuration space of these flexible cycloalkanes. And flexible cyclo, yeah. And so far in literature, only cycloheptane and cyclooctane have been studied in any detail. And even these studies, do not give any formal mathematical model to, generate the configuration space. They are kind of ad hoc and focused on that particular cycloalkane that they're looking at. So we use this idea of convex Cayley configuration spaces here. So first thing we do is convert this to a distance constraint graph. We treat all the carbon atoms as points in a graph, and then we add a distance constraint between carbon atoms that share a bond. And then because the bond angle between the 3 carbon atoms is fixed, we can add a distance constraint between the carbon atoms that are separated by that are separated by this one. And we end up with a constraint graph. So like I talked about earlier, there are certain classes of graphs where that have Cayley configuration, that admit Cayley configuration spaces. So it turns out that these Cayley configuration space, these cycloalkane graphs, they they do not have this property. So what we do is we drop certain edges. So this is the cycloalkane constraint graph that I have. This is cycloheptane, 7 molecules, and edges for bonds and edges for angle constraints and so on. So what I do here is I drop these 3 edges that I've shown in red here. And so as soon as I drop these 3 edges, it becomes a partial 3 tree. And because it's it's a partial 3 tree, it admits Cayley configurations, convex Cayley configuration spaces. All I would have to do is add in non-edges that complete this to a 3 tree, and if I parameterize the configuration space on these non-edges, I'll get a convex space. So what do we do with this convex space? So let's say that this was the original graph G. By modifying this graph, I got a graph G dash, and let's call this graph H, where I've added the non-edges. So we sample the Cayley configuration space of H on the set of newly added edges that I call, these green edges that I call F. And for each configuration in this configuration space, what we do is we compute the realization of this H. And once we computed the realization, we, in the realization, we can measure the lengths of these dropped edges. So notice that in this H, 4, 3 and 5, 3 and 2, 4 are not really edges, they are non-edges. So when I realize this graph for some length values of these green edges, I can measure the length of what this 4, 3 non-edge is taking. And I only keep the configurations where this non-edges, where these non-edges kind of take the value that they had in the original graph. And why is this an easy way of doing it? Is because realizing this graph is, first of all, sampling this space is very easy because this area is convex. I can use any convex sampling method to directly sample this space. And then once I've done that, the realization step is also very easy. So so this is again cycloheptane. I've kind of split this up into its 4 constituent tetrahedra. and each tetrahedron can be realized very quickly. So I have, a triangle here, and I can intersect two spheres to get the two realizations and so on. So yeah, that's how we plan to generate the Cayley configuration space of the cycloheptanes. And notice that I showed the example of cycloheptane, but it's also the same for cyclooctane. I can always just drop 3 edges and get a partial 3 tree, and I'll have to add how many ever more edges to kind of make it a 3 tree. And once I have a 3 tree, I can the non edges that I added to make it a 3 tree are convex. Okay. Do you have any questions so far? Okay.
Yes, wait, Prabhu.
Yeah.
So I'm a little confused. You're doing the sampling, but it seems like you should never get edges that are equal to the edges in G, the length edges. Like, what if you're doing random sampling? How come you ever get any of them to be like that?
So we're not really doing random sampling. So what we are doing is, like I said, because this is a 3 tree, and I've added these non-edges that make it a 3 tree. This kind of gives the entire configuration space of all the realizable edge lengths that this linkage can take, right? And like I talked about earlier, this is a linear polytope, and in that linear polytope, we kind of do a uniform sort of grid sampling, and at each of those configurations, we try and measure the lengths of the non-edges. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah, I guess that maybe makes more sense. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Next, we'll talk about this idea of optimal recombination. We talked about a little bit about this 2 weeks ago or so, where you start with a given DR plan, and you have the solutions to each of the subsystems, and you're trying to recombine the subsystems to get the original system. Like, you're kind of doing a bottom-up building to go from your solutions of your subsystems to the original graph. So we kind of saw that this optimization, this recombination, if you do it in a naive way, your algebraic complexity can really grow. And because of that, we had this whole idea of how do we optimize this recombination step. And when we talked about it last, we were optimizing for algebraic complexity using rational quaternion parameters, and we studied greedy algorithm that was developed using the underlying matroid called the seam matroid, and so on. So now I'll be talking about how we use Cayley parameters to optimize for algebraic complexity when recombining solutions. So we are not using quaternion parameters anymore, and we are using Cayley parameters instead. So this brings us to the idea of optimal modification for decomposition. So even though the slides I present here talk about how we modify an indecomposable system so that we get a small DR plan. Even when you have a decomposable system, sometimes this idea of optimal modification is useful. So you're at a particular node in the DR plan, and you cannot decompose it any further. So you have, let's say, n subsystems that you want to combine. So this idea of optimal modification talks about how can we modify that node, so that modify the node slightly so that instead of getting this indecomposable system, we get a small DR plan that preserves the solutions of the original system before modification. And then it should also be very easy to search for this original solutions in the modified system. So this gives us the idea of the OMDK problem. So you're given an independent graph G with no non-trivial proper isostatic subgraph. That is, your original graph G is indecomposable, and you're given two constants K and S. So the question of the OMDK problem is, does there exist a set of edges that I can remove from the original graph G? And I don't want to remove more than K edges, and a set of non-edges F, so that the modified graph where I remove the edges in E1 and add the edges in the set of non-edges F has a DR plan of size at most S. So I'm taking the original graph, removing certain edges, at most K edges, I'm adding some non-edges, some non-edge, I'm making them edges, and I'm asking whether this new graph has a size at most S. That is, can I decompose it into at most S subgraphs, rigid subgraphs? So notice that the OMDK problem, the K is a fixed bound. It's not part of the input. It's part of the problem itself. And if we can find such a tuple G, comma S, then we call it a member of the set OMDK. So in this paper by Troy Baker et al., they kind of showed that if you are given an indecomposable graph G, then if you take the spanning partial two tree, so you want all the vertices to be covered in the subgraph that you're taking, and if that subgraph is a partial two tree, and if you can get to it by removing at most K edges, then G2 belongs to the OMDK set. That is, you'll have you start with the original graph that's indecomposable, then you modify it, and now your DR plan has size 2. You can decompose it into two rigid subgraphs. So they proved this for 2D, I think. Yeah. So you start with the graph G, and the problem statement says that I can remove K edges to get a two tree, a partial two tree. And once I get a partial two tree, I can complete it to a two tree by adding certain non-edges. And because a two tree has DR plan of size 2, that is, two tree is just a bunch of triangles glued together. I can always pull out a triangle and recursively decompose it this way. The modified graph H has a DR plan of size 2. So if a graph has this property that by removing k edges, it becomes a partial tree, then we call this in short as k approximately convexifiable. So you may notice that I listed 3 properties earlier. One of them was small DR plan, then the solution preservation and efficient search. This kind of addresses 2 of the problems. So, but it does not talk anything about being able to efficiently find solution for the original graph G. So that's where the idea of convex Cayley configuration spaces comes in. Basically, you had a partial 2-tree that you completed to a 2-tree by adding the set of non-edges F. Therefore, the configuration space you get by doing this is convex, and you can efficiently search that configuration space to find the solution of the original graph. So this theorem is kind of saying that. So if you're given an indecomposable k approximate convexifiable graph, that is from the graph G, I can remove at most k edges and make it a partial 2-tree. Partial 2-tree, then and let F be the set of non-edges of G that I add to make it a 2-tree. So H is the 2-tree now. So each solution of the original graph for an orientation type can be found in order log W, where W is like the discrete volume of this configuration space. So I've divided, I've done a uniform grid sampling on the configuration space, and W is the volume, and it says that I can find this given an orientation type for the original solution of the original graph. I can find this in order log W. This is just by doing binary search on all the different parameters. But you have to notice that W is exponential in the size of F, or it's polynomial in the range of F. So let's do an example to kind of see how this works. So you have your original graph. This is a K33. And as you can see, this does not have any decomposable portion. So if I were to split this up, I think I'll only get edges. I don't think we even have triangles here. So if I want to find the realization of this K33, if I rule out, even if I rule out isometry, I'm going to rule out isometry. So I'll place the one of the vertices at the origin, and then I'll place another vertex on the x-axis. Even then, I'll have to deal with 8 quadratics and 8 variables. So there are 8 more edges. So the 8 more edges, and for each vertex I have the x and the y variables. So I'll have to solve, to realize this system, I'll have to solve a quadratic system, a system of 8 quadratic equations in 8 variables. So let's see how we can do better by using this idea of optimal modification. So I'll identify 2 edges, E1 and E2, and I'll remove them from the original graph. Once I remove them from the original graph, this is G dash. This turns out to be a partial 2-tree. And on this partial 2-tree graph, I can I can add 2 edges here, 2 non-edges here, F1 and F2, to make it a 2-tree, a complete 2-tree. So if you can see, I don't know if you can see it the way I've drawn the K33. There's one triangle, and then you paste another triangle on the edge, another triangle on the edge, and so on. So you get a complete 2 tree. So what we do is generate the Cayley configuration space of this linkage on F1 and F2. And you sample the entire configuration space basically. And once you sample the entire configuration space, you have a convex region through which you have to search for configurations whose realization gives you, the length of the original dropped edges E1 and E2. So it also turns out that the theorem here said that there is a way of doing this optimal modification such that you have to remove at most k edges to get this optimally modified graph. But for K33, it turns out that there is another way of doing it. So all you have to do in this case is drop just one edge. And when you remove that one edge and draw and add this new non-edge F3, you have what are called tree decomposable graphs. And it's shown that even for tree decomposable graphs, the set of the Cayley configuration space is convex. And you can do the same thing again. You sample the the realizable lengths of F3 for and at every realization you compute the length of the non-edge E here, and then see if you find the original length, and those will be your configurations. And previously we had to solve a system of 8 quadratics with 8 variables, but now because you've modified it, at each stage, this realization step, you have to just solve two quadratics. No, I think you can even make it even better. You can do 1 quadratic and 1 linear, because it's just a circle intersection. Okay. So the idea of optimal modification OMD was in this paper. It's an optimal decomposition and decombination of isostatic geometric systems. And here are some other references for this. So do we have any questions so far?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Rahul.
Yeah.
So yeah. My question is that this procedure improve the numerical stability.
Say that again.
So does this procedure improve the numerical stability?
Improve numerical stability.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by numerical stability?
Like solving the original one.
Solving?
Yeah, like the error. If you solve the original one, like eight quadratic equations, right? So
no.
So
the original system, if we hadn't modified it, that would have had 8 quadratics and 8 variables. But
then the error bound, right? If you perturb the input, then the output, the error of the output will be quite large, right? Because you have a have a many equations, many variables, right?
Yes.
So,
So,
but now, yeah,
so go ahead.
yeah. But now you're doing it this way, so
Yeah.
so that means the error is smaller. Huh?
Yes. So it's not just about the error being small.
Mhm.
It's also about interactability. So as and when the system kind of goes higher, the size of the system kind of becomes larger. Most softwares won't even be able to handle those large systems. But here you have a nice way of solving these. Just circle intersections. So yeah. Does that answer your question, or was it something?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I think Dr. Sitaram, so this is what I planned for today. I think I've finished a lot earlier than I thought I would. Should I continue, or should I just stop here and talk about?
I think you should continue.
Okay.
I mean, I think you went very fast through the very first section.
Yeah.
I mean, the notation is bad and hard for people to follow. But in any case, some of it was already done by
Sean. Yeah.
Sean, and I think the main theorem is somehow missing in here, by the way.
Which one?
I think it was theorem 5.10 in the paper. These are all ways to, I mean, along the way, proving that theorem.
Oh,
yeah. Item B. Yeah, item B.
Huh.
Every under constraint to some component is a partial 3-3. That's sort of like the key theorem. So item B in theorem 5.10, the things that you had there are sort of along the proving it, see all these little other theorems that are needed to prove it.
Yeah.
But that's where I would have expected to have spent quite a bit more time so people followed it. But I would suggest you just proceed with whatever you had planned. And there's plenty of material there that maybe even Thursday would not have been sufficient to cover. So simply add to it if necessary.
Okay.
For Thursday.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll talk about now this idea of using Cayley configuration spaces in molecular assembly. So I'll spend some time setting up the problem, and then I'll talk about how Cayley configuration spaces are kind of used here. So molecular assembly is a process in which these huge protein molecules that have potentials on their atoms, they are guided by local interactions, and they arrange themselves into some predefined shape. What you see here on the right side is actin filaments kind of self-assembling here, and then what you see here on the bottom is what we call micellar fusion into clusters. So some examples of molecular assembly include protein docking, formation of actin filaments like I showed here, and another big thing is the self-assembly of virus capsids. And usually in all of these processes, we have what are called, these are all guided by these Lennard-Jones potentials. So if an atom pair, one on each different molecule, is at a certain distance from each other, the potential kind of drops, and those atoms kind of want to stay in that region. If they get too close, they get repelled, and if they're too far apart, they don't interact at all. So yeah, they kind of stay in this, they want to stay in this Lennard-Jones well. So here, even though I've shown multiple kind of particles assembling in both of these, we in this study, I'm just going to talk about two protein molecules assembling together. So you have protein molecule A, protein molecule B. You have atoms on the surfaces of these proteins that have potential, that have pairwise potential, with atoms on the opposite molecule. And if I want to generate the configuration space of all the orientations one protein molecule will take with respect to the other, this configuration space is topologically very complex. And I'll get a little bit into why it is topologically complex. So what we do here is, we kind of geometrize this. We geometrize this Lennard-Jones well into 3 discrete intervals. We say if the pairwise distance between 2 atoms is less than, it's less than a certain value, we say that it's geometrically infeasible and they're colliding. If the distance is too far apart, then we say that it's a non-interacting inactive constraint. And then if it's in this Lennard-Jones well, that is, if it's within this interval, then we say that those atoms are they are in an active constraint. So what I've shown here on the top right should give you some idea. So you have these protein molecules, you have these are numbered. An edge between, when I draw an edge between 2 atoms here, means that they are in, their pairwise distances within this Lennard-Jones well, and then they're interacting. So I can formally reduce this to.
Sorry, Rahul.
Yeah.
Could can you just go back to that picture? Yeah, this one. Are we assuming that the blue atoms are part of a molecule that's rigid?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So,
So the blue
yeah,
and green
we're assuming,
are rigid objects, and somehow we're trying to figure out how they configure
with respect to each other.
Ah,
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
Okay, good.
So even if they have internal degrees of freedom, we can deal with it. There's a generalized version of this, but then that again kind of uses this idea of decomposing this internally and finding out all the configurations. So here I'm assuming that both of these molecules are rigid. Yeah.
Basically, as he says, if it's not rigid, just decompose it into rigid pieces, and then there'll be some extra constraints in between the rigid pieces, and those will be treated similarly. We continue in this fashion.
So what we do is that we treat the atoms in each molecule as points, and then we say that we want all pairs of atoms, one from each point set, to be at a distance at least delta AB from each other. This is to prevent them from colliding with each other. So no molecules should get too close. And the second constraint says that, so if I have to generate the configuration space of one molecule with respect to the other, I don't want any configuration space where the second atom is kind of floating. So I hold the first molecule rigid. The second molecule, I want at least one constraint to be active. So at least one pair of atoms, one from each molecule, is within this Lennard-Jones well. So that's what the second constraint is saying. So, all these are basically distance constraints. So when I have a whole bunch of these, I get a semi-algebraic set, because it's a union of sets defined by polynomial inequalities. So you kind of get the idea why this space is not very nice. So we have this methodology called easel. So this basically does, it generates the configuration space of these two interacting molecules. So we employ some key strategies here. So the first strategy we employ is, because this configuration space is very not nice, we kind of first partition the configuration space into what we call active constraint regions. So an active constraint region is a set of configurations that all have one key property, in that the set of active constraints within all those configurations are the same. For example, if I have an active constraint region that has the set of active constraints A1, A2, that means all configurations in the A1, B1, all configurations of these two molecules within that region have the constraint A1, B1. So we partition the configuration space this way, and you can kind of see that if I have a constraint A1, B1, if I have A1, B1, and if I add an additional constraint A2, B2, that region sort of forms the boundary of my original A1, B1 region. So this kind of gives us like a stratification of these partitioned regions. We organize it like a directed acyclic graph. So we, like I'm showing it here. So this is one active constraint region. Here, this is characterized by this region has configurations that have these two particular constraints active. So this is what we call an active constraint graph. And there's a molecule here, and I'm only showing 3 of them. And this is just showing that some molecule, some atom here is connected to some atom here. So the children of this, what we call active constraint region, are exactly those that have these constraints plus one additional extra constraint. So as you can see, if you see the graph here, they have the same constraint as in the parent, but they have one additional extra constraint. So the same here, the same here. And we kind of stratify it this way. So you have 5-dimensional regions where just one constraint active, then there is 4, and all the way, we go all the way to the bottom where all the configurations are kind of rigid. The second strategy we apply is, I said the active constraint region at the top is 5-dimensional, And if my goal is to find all the 0-dimensional configurations, there are two ways I can go about it. First one is I start in the middle of the 5D region and shoot race everywhere and hope that it hits a 0D configuration, which is not a very good strategy. So what I do is, this is a 3D and a kind of analogy for what we're doing. So we start at the center of this cube and we shoot race to find a lower dimension, a lower dimensional boundary that is just 1 dimension lower. So for example, if I started with a 4-dimensional active constraint region here and I shoot race, I'm only looking for 3-dimensional active constraint regions. So in this cube example, I shoot race everywhere, and it's much more likely that I'll hit a face than directly hit a corner. So once I hit a face, again, I'll do the same act there again. I'll shoot race all along the surface, and it's much more likely to hit an edge than it is to hit corners. Again, this way I recursively decompose from the center of a 5D region to I go to a 4D, 3D, 2D, and so on, and all the way I go to 0-dimensional regions. So once I have the stratification and I have a strategy for how, and I have this second strategy, which is saying I want to do recursive search. The third key strategy is this idea of Cayley convexification. So what we do here is, so maybe I should pull up this graph. Hold on. Okay. Should I just saw your chat, Dr. Sitam. So were you referring to the initial portion of the?
That was 20 minutes ago. Just ignore it.
Okay.
Rahul.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So when we are doing molecular assembly, these are this picture shows all the possible graphs you can get.
We can't see anything.
Oh. Okay. Yeah. So when we're doing assembly of 2 molecules, these are all the possible contact graphs you can get. So when I mean contact here, it means that a pair of atoms, one from each molecule, is in the Lennard-Jones well. So let me explain what the blue and the green are. So the green are all the atoms on one molecule. The blue are all the atoms on the other molecule. Not all of them, some of them. So this green set also has other atoms attached to it, and this blue set has other atoms attached to it. So I'm just showing the ones that are in an active constraint. So this this picture lists all the possible ways in which you can kind of have contacts in molecular assembly. And it turns out that most of these graphs are partial 3 trees, and because they're partial 3 trees, I can add non-edges to make it a complete 3 tree, and my configuration space now becomes convex. and because it becomes convex, sampling in it becomes very easy. So for example, here I'm showing the configuration space of these two molecules. So there's a blue molecule here, tiny blue molecule here with 6 atoms, and then there's another green molecule here with 6 atoms. And what I'm showing on the top here is the configuration space. And of course, yeah, I have to mention that this all configurations in this region have 4 active constraints. So it's a 2-dimensional active constraint region. So if I look at the configuration space in the regular Cartesian or quaternion parameterization, this is what it looks like. And
What is each point on top?
yeah, so each point here is an individual configuration in this active constraint region, and all configurations in this configuration space have exactly 4 active constraints, and they're all the same 4 active constraints. And I've grouped them into these different colors to indicate that they form a contiguous region in the Cartesian space. So as you can see, if I use a Cartesian or quaternion parameterization, this is what I have to deal with. The configuration.
Why are there
spaces.
gaps there?
Why are there gaps here in the Cartesian?
Yeah.
So there are 2 reasons there are gaps here. One is that some of these regions are the configurations in some of these regions violate tetrahedral inequalities, and the other reason is I mentioned this this other constraint here where I said that the molecules cannot get too close to each other. So I've ignored all those configurations. And also I have to say that if you represent this active constraint region in Cartesian parameterization, this is that has 6 parameters. So it's a 6D space that I've kind of projected onto 3D. I've just projected it onto the 3 XYZ parameters, and the angle parameters they've just been smooshed down. So even though this looks disconnected here, it may not really be disconnected, because it's just no, it should be disconnected in the 6D as well.
Also, I mean, it's 6 dimensions, but you expect this to have a 2-dimensional structure because there are 4 active constraints, right?
Yeah. So it's a 2D space within a 6D region.
What's a circular pattern represents?
The circular pattern here?
Yeah, what does it represent? You may be asking about 2 different things. So the first thing is each of these configurations, you know what each of these configurations are, each of these little dots are, right? They're all these configurations that you can take while maintaining those 4 contacts. If you're asking why this is kind of like a circle, it's probably because you have 1 atom in the middle, 1 molecule in the middle, and then you have a certain set of contacts, and then the other molecule is kind of moving around it, right? And so it represents some motion?
Huh?
Does it represent motion?
No. This is not representing any. So if you see in this graph up here, it consists of a whole bunch of little dots. Is that visible?
So each of those dots is a different configuration. So
Yeah, in a way, it represents a motion if you looked.
I mean, if you traversed on this surface, it would.
It's got 2 degrees of freedom, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you traversed on this surface here, from one configuration to another configuration here, it would represent motion of this going around. Does that
And
answer
that
your question?
motion is periodical, right?
Periodic in what way?
Well, we are talking molecules here, right? And
Yes.
there are atoms and
Yeah.
of course electrons, and so it's natural to expect this kind of periodicity or circularity or whatever. But the question is, and sorry, I just showed up in your talk only now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but the natural question is, all this optimization and
Mhm.
your strategies ended up with a beautiful picture,
Mm.
and the details are very, very basic, very interesting to know the exact details.
Yeah. So so I don't know if I mentioned this before. So we are, when we're doing this, generating this configuration space, we are not doing any dynamics or anything. We are just laying out the potential energy landscape. So I don't know if you, by periodicity, you meant something about motions and things like that.
Well, it will be interesting to look at the connection, but I don't want to stop your flow here.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You might want to use the word sampling.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're sampling the configuration space. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are all samples in the configuration space. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this this thing on top that looks quite ugly is the active constraint region with Cartesian parameterization. But as soon as you switch to Cayley parameters, this becomes convex. It's just a 2D region, and sampling here is so much easier. I can just do a regular grid sampling here, whereas here I would have struggled quite a bit to do that. Okay. So after we do all of these, we generate a lot of properties of the configuration space, which include potential energy basins and so on. But the next thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of finding paths in the assembly configuration space. So the idea is we start with a rigid configuration, and I'm given a source and a destination rigid configuration. And I want to drop one constraint at a time to reach from source to a destination that gives me kind of like a smooth 1D OF path. So all these configurations in the middle here, I get to each one by dropping a constraint, moving a little bit, adding a different constraint, then dropping another constraint, moving a little, and so on, till I reach my destination here. So we want to find a continuous motion path, and this path is made up of segments. So think of this as the path, and it has these little segments. So these little squares in along the path, these are all rigid configurations. So I start from a rigid configuration. I drop a constraint. So I have 1 degree of freedom. So I kind of flex the molecule. and end up in a different rigid configuration. Now I drop a different constraint, I get a flex, and I do this over and over again till I reach my destination. So if you look at the entire configuration space as a polytope, it's not going to be as nice as this cube, but essentially what you're doing is you're starting from a vertex, walking along an edge to a different vertex, and then walking along a different edge to a different vertex. Since you keep doing this over and over again till I reach my destination rigid configuration. So as you can imagine, if I were to give you the original configuration space, this would be quite hard to do because it's highly non-convex and disconnected, and you wouldn't know where a 1D configuration would be. So it would be quite hard. But in Easel, because we have kind of partitioned the configuration space and kind of arranged it neatly, when I start at a rigid configuration, if I drop an active constraint, I know exactly the configuration space, the 1D configuration space I'll be in. So I can traverse along that 1D configuration space and then add a different constraint and go to a different 0D configuration, and I keep doing this over and over again. So this is what we call the atlas, by the way, that I showed you earlier. And the config, and what we show on the right, these are all rigid configurations, and these are all active constraint regions that have 1 degree of freedom. So yeah. So I don't think I've mentioned this before. Maybe I should. The Easel's sampling is not a one-to-one map to the Cartesian sampling. It's a many-to-one map. So each little configuration here, each little sample here, if you will, it corresponds to finitely many different configurations in the Cartesian parameterization. So whatever I've shown in pink here, all these correspond to the configurations that are pink in the upstairs as well, in the Cartesian configuration space. There's some little gold colored ones here that correspond to these, but all these black configurations that I've shown, these correspond to configurations that have that belong in multiple of these different groups. So Easel's parameterization is a many-to-one map. So if I have to do pathfinding and I have to traverse Easel's 1D region, it's not as straightforward as just walking along a 1D region. So it's basically like a sheet of pancakes of 1D regions that are stuck on top of each other, and they kind of attach only at certain places, and only there I'm allowed to switch between the different pancakes. So here, for example, I've shown a 1D Cayley configuration space. This entire set is a 1 Cayley point, so is this, and so on. So the split kind of shows that it corresponds to many Cartesian configurations. So when I'm in a 0D node and I drop a constraint, I could end up in any of these different Cartesian configurations, and I can only traverse along ones that are connected by an edge. So if I traverse along these sequence of blue boxes, that represents a smooth 1 degree of freedom motion. So I cannot switch, for example, from this blue to this red unless a special thing happens. So there are what are called tetrahedral bounds, where these flips, as we call them, meet. And if you have two such things meeting, then
I can, for example, start from this pink little square here, move along here, and at this point, I can switch to the orange, and I can, go. And this would still represent a smooth 1D of motion. So that's not interesting. Okay, so I'm given a source and a destination configuration. What I can do is I can first find out a sequence of these adds and drops. So start with a 0, drop an edge, add a different edge, and so on. So I can figure out a sequence of adds and edge, add, and drops that will give that will get me from the source to the destination. So that is that kind of tells me if a potential path even exists. And once I do that, I'll have to go ahead and evaluate if after I drop a constraint from a 0D node and end up in a 1D node, if I can even traverse to a different configuration in the 1D node where I can add a different constraint. So all we'd have to do is at the outermost level, we call this the region flip graph. In the atlas, we just figure out a sequence of potential adds and drops that will get me from the source to the destination. And then within 1D active constraint region, I do the same thing. I again, define a different graph and traverse it. So, so putting it all kind of together, let's say I'm in this source configuration. Yeah, let's say this is my source configuration, right? I'm in this source configuration. I can drop a constraint. I'll end up in the parent, and I can traverse this parent, like kind of flex the parent configuration to end up in a different configuration where I am allowed to add a different edge to end up in a different rigid configuration. And from here, I can drop a different constraint and end up in a different 1D active constraint region. And I can keep doing this over and over again till I reach my destination configuration. So I think I'll stop here. So we're working on a software that kind of finds these paths in the configuration space, and hopefully it'll be completed soon. Maybe on Thursday I can give a little demo. Oh, okay, I have this here. This is from an early version. So that was the source configuration at the beginning, and then these are all the different intermediate configurations it takes to reach the destination. There was some issue with this. Was showing more configurations than required, but hopefully on Thursday I'll be able to kind of show this working for all set of molecules.